Okay, so for dry techniques, we call these dry techniques because basically we're working with a way to gouge or engrave lines into the plate that don't involve acid. So the acid is wet. So things like etching, aquatint that require you to dunk it in the acid tank are the wet techniques. And things that don't require that, like engraving, dry point, sort of scuffing up with sandpaper, the roulette tool, all those things are what we call dry techniques because they're dry. You don't need acid for them. They're really great if you want to go in and add sort of darker marks or lines or things like that to a plate that's pretty close to done, just needs a little bit of punching up. The dry techniques can be really useful for that. So I have kind of a variety of tools over here that I'll walk you through to show you different things you can do with the dry techniques. Probably the most important thing to know though is that any old tool that you have around that has a sharp point in it that's hard enough to kind of gouge or scratch a mark into your plate will print. So when you run your finger over it, you just want to feel for places where you've scratched. And so if you want, you can put your plate face down on the floor and scuff it around on here and you'll get a whole bunch of random stray scratches and marks that will make an indentation and will hold ink. But for you, you'll have a tool that has a burnisher on one end of it and then your sharp point on the other one. You can sharpen that up and then you can go ahead and just kind of scratch lines into the plate, and you can use whatever kind of technique you want. The harder that you push down, sort of the deeper and darker that mark is going to be. So as we go across here, you'll be able to see that when we go to proof this and print it. Another thing to know is that when you're drawing with this, if you have your sort of steel tool straight up and down like this, you're going to kick a burr out on both sides of the tip, both sides of the point. And that's going to be a little thicker, darker line. If you tip it this way, you're going to get only a burr kind of that shoots out one direction off of the edge of your, the point of your tool. And so it's going to have a little different character. If you tip it too much this way, you're not going to really kick up much of a burr. So really like a 45-degree angle or straight up and down is how you want to hold the tool as you're dry pointing. So again, a dry point is just very brutal. You just gouge and hold the tool and gouge. And so you can see that as I do this, I'm kind of leaving these marks that are like, it's kind of hard to control. Like if I want to get a really nice spiral with dry point with my metal steel tool, it's really hard. It kind of jumps around on me a lot. So there's this tool they came up with that's got a diamond tip in it. It's a really, really tiny, small diamond. But the beautiful thing about a diamond tip is that when you draw with this, it's like butter. It just flows and tears up that copper. So a diamond tip tool is the one to use if you want really smooth, kind of subtle dry point lines, and you can see how much easier that was to draw than the ones that I was working on before. So the diamond tip cuts easier and a little bit deeper, and it's also a lot easier to control. But you can also go with really light marks. So if I'm working on my dog that I've been drawing on here, and I just kind of subtly, like really subtly scratch some hash marks into that dog, it's gonna make a little tiny gray scratch. It's gonna be really small. Versus if I take a tool like this one with a sharp point on it and I gouge like crazy this line right along here, that's going to be a very thick, dark mark, and so when we proof that, you'll probably be able to see that. But again, there's multiple ways that you can put scratch marks onto a plate. So if all we're trying to do is scuff it up, you could use any variety of tools. You can use your triangular scraper here, and you can kind of gouge some big, thick lines in there. You can use dental tools, you can use power tools. Some people like to use things like rotary flexible shaft tools, things like that on there. Anything you want. You can also use sandpaper. So if you want to take some really, some sandpaper like this, you know, just a really 600 type grit sandpaper, and you want to scratch that on the plate, that's going to raise just enough of a burr to make it kind of gray. So that'll hold a lot of plate tone in that area. If you want to use some thicker, this is more like 100 grit sandpaper, you can use that, and if we scratch that into the plate up here, that's going to leave deeper, kind of more abrasive, coarse marks, and so these two areas are going to print quite differently when we go to print them. But it's the same principle that it's scuffing up the plate, so it's going to hold some ink in there. The last thing we have, you can also use steel wool if you want. Steel wool will actually buff out some of the scratches sometimes in dry point and kind of smooth them out. If you get the coarse dry wool, that'll actually grunge it up quite a bit too. So again, the more abrasive and gnarly your scratching tool is, the deeper and darker the marks will be. Last two tools are these roulette tools. So they're called roulettes just because they have little kind of patterns that are etched into these round drums that roll around a central axis. And so if you roll that onto your plate, kind of like this, you can see that this random roulette tool is going to add kind of a, it's going to scuff up the plate and add like kind of a dark stippled area to your plate. So that can be really useful if you want to kind of control something or you know, have a little bit tighter control. They also have line roulette tools. We'll have a whole bunch of these in the shop eventually. And the other one that we have is this one, which is basically a wheel tool. And if as I roll this along my plate, it's going to leave a very mechanical looking kind of line pattern in the plate. And that can also add kind of almost like cross-hatching. You can cross these lines back and forth. But that's going to rough up the surface of the plate, and that's going to hold some ink when we go to print it. So when we go to proof this, you'll see that we'll have all these different kinds of marks on there, all from the dry techniques.